Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we love to really get into the nitty-gritty of complex topics? Well, today we're going deep on something super fundamental to medical research. It's all about cGCP, or current good clinical practice. You've probably heard this term thrown around, especially if you're following new drug developments and clinical trials. It's basically the rule book for how these trials should be conducted, ensuring everything is ethical, scientifically sound, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, think of it as like the bedrock of trustworthy clinical research, right? Like you want to be confident that new medicines are actually safe and effective before they hit the market, and cGCP is all about putting those safeguards in place.
Exactly. It's not just about pushing new treatments out there willy-nilly. It's about doing it right, protecting the people participating in these trials, and making sure the data we're basing decisions on is actually reliable. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together some really interesting sources for you. We're looking at transcripts from the FDA, big guys themselves, as well as insights from industry experts on YouTube. And we've even dug into the actual Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, where all this stuff is laid out officially.
Oh, nice. Yeah, the CFR can be a bit of a beast to navigate. It's like dense legal language galore, but it's the source of truth, right? It's where the actual rules and requirements live.
Exactly. So our mission today is to distill all this info for you. We're going to extract the essential principles of cGCP, the regulatory framework it sits within, and really highlight why this stuff matters for protecting trial participants and making sure the research we're doing is top-notch. We want to give you a clear understanding without bogging you down with too much technical jargon. Sound good?
Absolutely. Let's demystify cGCP together, right?
All right, so let's start with the absolute basics here. What exactly is cGCP? Like, if you had to explain it to someone who's completely new to this whole world, how would you break it down?
Okay, so in a nutshell, cGCP is a set of ethical and scientific quality standards. And these standards, they apply to every single stage of a clinical trial, from how you design the study in the first place to how you actually conduct it, collect the data, all the way to reporting the results.
So it's not just about, like, don't fake the data. It's much broader than that.
Oh yeah, it's way more comprehensive than that. It's about ensuring the entire research process is conducted with integrity, every step of the way. And this is crucial because, well, first and foremost, you're dealing with human beings who are participating in these trials, right?
Yeah,
So their safety and well-being are absolutely paramount.
makes sense.
And then the second big goal is to ensure that the data coming out of these trials is, well, credible and reliable. If the data's messed up, then the whole thing falls apart, right? You can't make sound decisions about new treatments based on faulty data.
Right, right. Like the whole foundation of medical progress is based on having solid research. So if the research is flawed, then everything built on top of it is shaky too.
Exactly. And, that's something the FDA really emphasizes in their training materials, which we looked at for this episode. They're all about data reliability and, of course, participant protection. It's like those two things are their main focus when they go and inspect clinical trials, making sure everyone's following the rules.
Yeah, and that's really reassuring to know, right? Like
Yeah,
there's a system in place to check that everything is being done properly. It's not just left up to chance.
for sure.
Okay, so we've got a sense of what cGCP is all about. Now, let's unpack some of the key ethical principles that underpin all of this. This is the foundation, right? Like, what are the guiding values that drive everything else?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most fundamental principles is the concept of informed consent. You can't just grab anyone off the street and enroll them in a clinical trial without their full understanding and agreement. It's got to be voluntary, right?
Yeah, informed consent is huge. Like, people need to know what they're getting into, the potential risks, the benefits, the whole 9 yards,
Yeah.
and they have to freely choose to participate.
Right, exactly. It's an ongoing process, too, not just a one-time thing. As the trial progresses, if new information comes up or if things change, the participants need to be kept in the loop, and they always have the right to withdraw if they want to.
Right. And there are specific regulations around this, right? Like, it's not just a suggestion. It's legally mandated how this process needs to be handled.
Yeah, definitely. The regulations on protection of human subjects, it's all laid out in 21 CFR Part 50. That's where the details are.
Oh, 21 CFR Part 50, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
I think that came up in one of the FDA training videos we watched. They mentioned a specific form too, the FDA 1572, if I remember correctly. What was that all about?
Yes. The 1572, also known as the Statement of Investigator. That's a pretty important document. It's basically where the clinical investigator, the doctor or scientist running the trial, puts it in writing that they're going to play by the rules, follow the approved protocol, and make sure informed consent is done right for every participant.
So it's like a pledge of commitment to doing things ethically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're signing on the dotted line saying, I'm going to uphold GCP standards. I'm responsible for what happens at my site. It's a big deal.
Gotcha. And another thing that came up in those FDA videos was the role of institutional review boards, or IRBs. Can you remind me what those are all about?
Oh, yeah. IRBs are super important for the ethical oversight of clinical trials. They're like independent committees, usually made up of doctors, scientists, ethicists, and community members. And their job is to review and approve any research study that involves human participants.
So they're the ones who decide if a study is ethical enough to go ahead.
Exactly. They scrutinize everything, the study protocol, the informed consent documents, the whole package to make sure it meets all the ethical and regulatory requirements. And they can say no, right? If they don't think a study is ethical or safe enough, they can stop it in its tracks.
Oh, wow. Okay. So they have some real power there.
Oh,
And I think there was a point made in one of the videos about how even in cases where a study might be exempt from needing an IND, an investigational new drug application, it still has to go through IRB review and meet those informed consent and promotion regulations.
yeah, that's right. So it highlights how central ethical oversight is, regardless of the specific regulatory pathway a study might fall under. It's like, no matter what, you got to have that independent check to ensure the well-being of the participants.
That makes sense. It's like the ethics are non-negotiable, even if there are some exemptions in other areas.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the ethical principles, which are clearly crucial. Now, let's zoom out a little bit and look at the broader legal and regulatory framework that governs clinical trials. This can get pretty complex, so where do we even begin to understand this whole landscape?
So the bedrock of all FDA regulations, and this includes all the rules for clinical investigations, is the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, specifically Title 21. That's the big one.
Title 21, right, yeah. I remember seeing that referenced a lot in the materials we looked at.
Yeah, it's like the Bible of FDA regulations, covering everything from food to drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, you name it. And within Title 21, you've got all these different parts that focus on specific areas. And of course, some of those parts are dedicated specifically to clinical trials.
Okay, so can you walk us through some of those key parts that are particularly relevant to understanding cGCP? Like, which ones should we really pay attention to?
Okay, so we've already touched on Part 50, right? That's the one all about protection of human subjects. That's where they lay out all the detailed requirements for getting informed consent and making sure participants are treated ethically.
Right, right. Super important.
Then there's Part 56, which focuses specifically on institutional review boards. Outlining their responsibilities, how they're supposed to operate, what they need to look for when reviewing studies, all that good stuff.
So those two parts are pretty much directly connected to the ethical principles we talked about earlier, making sure those principles are actually put into practice.
Exactly. And then another really crucial part is Part 312, which covers investigational new drug applications, or INDs for short.
Ah, INDs. Yeah, I've heard that term before. It's basically the application you need to submit to the FDA before you can even start testing a new drug in humans, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like your proposal, your plan for how you're going to conduct the trial, what data you're going to collect, how you're going to ensure participant safety, all of that. And the FDA reviews it really carefully to make sure everything is up to snuff before they give you the go-ahead.
And I vaguely remember hearing something about a 30-day review period for IND protocols. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. The FDA aims to review IND applications within 30 days. And unless they issue a clinical hold, which is basically like a pause button because of safety concerns or something like that, you can usually start your trial after that 30-day period.
Wow, 30 days seems pretty fast considering how much information must be in those applications.
Yeah, it is. So it really highlights how important it is for sponsors, the companies or organizations running the trials, to submit a really comprehensive and well-organized application from the get-go. You don't want to waste any time going back and forth with the FDA because, time is money in drug development.
Totally, especially when you're talking about potentially life-saving treatments. Every delay can have an impact. Okay, so we've got the IND, which is all about getting permission to start testing. What about the regulations that govern the actual data that's collected during a trial? Like, how do we make sure that data is reliable and accurate?
That's where Part 11 comes into the picture. It's all about electronic records and electronic signatures. These days, pretty much all clinical trial data is handled electronically, right? So Part 11 lays out the rules for making sure these electronic records are just as trustworthy and reliable as old school paper records used to be.
So it's basically bringing those good record-keeping practices into the digital age.
Exactly. With electronic data, you've got new challenges like the potential for data manipulation or, accidentally deleting something without a trace. So Part 11 is all about establishing controls to prevent those issues. You need audit trails, validation of the computer systems, all that stuff to ensure the integrity of the data.
Makes sense. So it's like the same principles of good documentation apply, but you need extra safeguards in place when you're dealing with digital information.
Exactly.
Okay, and finally, what about the actual investigational product itself? The drug or treatment that's being tested. Are there regulations in place to make sure those are manufactured to a certain standard for use in clinical trials?
Oh, absolutely. That falls under good manufacturing practice or GMP. It's a whole other set of regulations, but it's super important because, if the drug itself is shoddy or inconsistent, then the whole trial could be compromised.
Right, like you're trying to test whether a treatment works, but if the quality of the treatment itself is all over the place, then your results are meaningless, right?
Exactly. You need that consistency to be confident in the data. And GMP ensures that, the manufacturing process is controlled, the quality is checked at every step, and the final product is, safe and reliable for use in human trials.
Okay, so it's like this web of interconnected regulations, cGCP, GMP, all working together to ensure the integrity of the whole research process, from the ethics to the data to the product itself.
Right, it's all connected.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the key operational standards that investigators and sponsors need to follow to really make sure they're implementing cGCP in practice. Like, beyond the big picture regulations, what are some of the day-to-day things that need to be done right?
Well, I think one of the most fundamental things is adhering to the approved study protocol. That document we talked about earlier that outlines exactly how the trial is supposed to be run, who's eligible to participate, what procedures need to be done, all of that.
Right, the roadmap for the whole trial.
Exactly. And every investigator signs that FDA 1572 form committing to follow the protocol. And this isn't just a suggestion, it's crucial for data integrity. If people are doing things differently at different sites or changing things up without proper authorization, it introduces a lot of variability and can really mess up the results.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need that consistency to be able to compare apples to apples, right? Otherwise, it's like you're running different experiments instead of one cohesive trial.
Right. And actually, we saw some interesting case studies in the OSIS workshop materials where even seemingly small deviations from the protocol caused huge problems during FDA inspections.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like in one case, they changed the timing of a specific assessment, like a blood draw or something, without documenting it properly or getting approval. And the FDA was like, whoa, what's going on here? This data might not be reliable. It can have big consequences.
Wow, so it's really about paying attention to the details and following the plan.
Absolutely.
What else is crucial in terms of operational standards?
Another huge one is good record keeping, meticulous record keeping. Every observation, every data point, every adverse event, everything needs to be documented clearly, accurately, and completely.
Oh, yeah. If it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. That's a mantra I've heard a lot in the research world.
Definitely. And again, this is something the FDA really scrutinizes during inspections. Are the records complete? Are they legible? Can you trace everything back to its source? It's all about creating an auditable trail of what happened during the trial.
And I've heard that this can be a common area where things go wrong, right? Like people get sloppy with their documentation or they don't enter data in a timely manner, and it can create problems.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can be tough to stay on top of everything, especially when you're busy running a trial, but it's so important.
Okay, so we've talked about the protocol and record keeping. What about the role of the clinical investigator specifically? The person who's ultimately responsible for the trial at their site.
Yeah.
What are their key responsibilities?
Well, they're the captain of the ship, right? They're the ones who are accountable for making sure everything is done according to GCP, even if they delegate certain tasks to other members of their team.
Right, so even if they have a whole research staff helping them out, the buck stops with the investigator.
Exactly. They need to make sure everyone is properly trained. They need to provide oversight, make sure the data is being collected properly, participants are being treated ethically, all of that.
So it's a big responsibility.
It is. And, this idea of inspection readiness came up in some of the FDA materials we reviewed. It's basically about always being prepared for an FDA inspection. Not in a panicked way, but in a we're doing things right all the time kind of way.
So it's not about scrambling to get your ducks in a row when you know an inspection is coming. It's about having your ducks in a row all the time.
Exactly. It's about building that culture of compliance and quality into everything you do.
Makes sense. And who actually conducts these inspections, by the way?
So that's the FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program, or BMO. They're the ones who go out and make sure everyone's following the rules.
BMO, okay. So they're the ones who show up and make sure you're not cutting any corners.
Yeah, they're the ones who make sure you're walking the walk, not just talking the talk when it comes to GCP.
And what happens after an inspection? Like, how does the FDA communicate their findings, and what impact can those findings have?
So after an inspection, they write up their findings and send them to the relevant review divisions within the FDA. And this can be really important because, if they found problems during the inspection, it can impact the review of a new drug application.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a slap on the wrist. It can have real consequences for the drug approval process.
Yeah, absolutely. If the FDA doesn't trust the data because of GCP violations or something like that, it can delay or even derail the whole approval process.
Okay, so it's really high stakes.
Mm.
And I think it used different classifications to describe the outcomes of these inspections, right? Like
Yep.
some are more serious than others.
Yeah, there are three main classifications: VAI, NAI, and OAI. VAI stands for Voluntary Action Indicated, which means, they found some minor issues and the site is expected to fix them. NAI is No Action Indicated, which is the best case scenario, meaning they didn't find anything major.
So NAI is like getting a gold star, basically.
Pretty much. And then there's OAI, which is Official Action Indicated. And that's the one you really don't want to get.
Yeah, OAI sounds ominous.
It is. It means they found some serious problems, and it could lead to, warning letters, fines, or even, disqualification from conducting future trials. It's a big deal.
Okay, so the stakes are high, and the consequences of not following cGCP can be pretty serious. But let's step back for a moment and remind ourselves why all of this matters in the first place. We've talked about the regulations, the operational standards, the inspections, but ultimately, what's the big picture here? Why is all this effort put into cGCP?
It boils down to two things, really: protecting the people who participate in these trials and making sure the research we're doing is good science, solid science that we can trust.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's about human lives, both the lives of the participants and the lives of the people who might benefit from the treatments that come out of this research.
Exactly, and cGCP provides the framework for doing that responsibly, ethically, and rigorously. The informed consent process ensures that people understand the risks and benefits before they agree to participate. The IRB review provides independent check to make sure the study is ethical. The meticulous record-keeping and data management practices ensure that the results are reliable. It's all connected.
Yeah, it's like a whole ecosystem of safeguards to make sure things are done right.
Exactly.
And this commitment to high-quality research, it benefits everyone, right? Not just the people in the trials, but ultimately it leads to better treatments, better health care, better outcomes for everyone.
Absolutely. It's about advancing medical knowledge in a way that's trustworthy and that actually benefits society.
So for our listeners out there who are, eager to learn and understand these complex topics, diving into cGCP is a great way to see how those ethical and scientific principles translate into real-world practice. It's like a peek behind the curtain of how medical progress is made. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just for scientists or researchers either, right? I think everyone should have a basic understanding of how clinical trials work, what safeguards are in place, how to evaluate the evidence. It's empowering.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's wrap things up here. What are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to walk away with today?
I think the main thing to remember is that cGCP is all about setting the bar high for clinical research. It's a comprehensive system of ethical and scientific standards backed by strong regulations to ensure that trials are conducted with integrity and that the results are reliable.
Right. And ultimately, it's about protecting the people involved in these trials and making sure the research that comes out of them is actually beneficial for society as a whole.
Exactly.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, but obviously this is just a starting point. There's a whole universe of information out there if you want to dive deeper.
Yeah, if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, you can always dig into those specific CFR parts we mentioned. Or, if you're curious about informed consent, there are tons of resources on that. The FDA website is a great place to start, and there are lots of other organizations that provide information and training on cGCP.
Definitely. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to chew on. We've talked about the rigorous standards that govern clinical research, where the stakes are incredibly high. But think about how those same principles, those core ideas of ethical conduct, data integrity, and robust oversight could be applied to other areas of life as well. Where decisions are being made based on data, where people's lives are being impacted, those same values should apply, right? It's a fascinating question to consider. So, until next time, keep those questions coming and keep exploring.